It began like a mystery from a novel, people getting sick without reason, their bodies slowly failing them. But this wasn't fiction. It was real. And it happened in a quiet British village named Bovingdon, in 1971. At first, no one noticed the pattern. A few employees at John Hadland Laboratories complained of strange symptoms: nausea, hair loss, numbness in their limbs. Some collapsed at home. Others were rushed to hospitals with their nervous systems shutting down. The symptoms were odd, terrifying, and medical experts were left scratching their heads. Then came the death of Bob Eagle, a well-liked lab technician. He had been complaining of stomach pain and weakness for days, but after returning to work, his condition worsened dramatically. Within days, he was paralyzed. Doctors diagnosed him with a rare neurological disorder. He died shortly after. The fear spread like wildfire. Was this a virus? A chemical leak? An unknown disease? Staff started whispering about a curse. A second man, Fred Biggs, fell ill next. His condition mirrored Bob's: chest pain, muscle weakness, and then full collapse. He too would not survive. By then, over 70 employees had reported strange symptoms. Some lost hair, others could barely walk. A few experienced confusion, severe fatigue, even tremors. What was happening inside this lab? Investigations began. The company produced infrared lenses, using rare materials like thallium, a highly toxic heavy metal. The management brought in their doctor, Ian Anderson, who assured everyone there was no cause for alarm. He claimed their processes were safe. But not everyone believed him. One quiet employee stood up during a meeting and questioned the doctor's conclusions. At first, people brushed him off. He wasn't a supervisor, just a warehouse worker. But then he began to speak in detail. Scientific detail. About toxicity, nerve damage, thallium's effects on the human body. He described symptoms that matched those of the victims perfectly. His name? Graham Young. He didn't look dangerous. But beneath the calm, ordinary face of this young man was a dark obsession, one that would lead to one of the most disturbing crime stories in British history. And this was just the beginning. Before Graham Young became the man who brought fear to an entire laboratory, he was just a boy, quiet, polite, and unervingly curious. But what set Graham apart wasn't how he behaved. It was what fascinated him. From an early age, Graham didn't dream of becoming a doctor or a pilot like most boys. He dreamed of becoming a master of chemicals, specifically poisons. While other kids played football, Graham read books about deadly toxins. He memorized the symptoms they caused, the organs they affected, the slow ways they could destroy a person from the inside out. His idols weren't athletes or movie stars. They were men like Dr. Crippen and William Palmer, notorious poisoners from Britain's dark past. By the age of 13, Graham's knowledge of toxicology was far beyond anything taught in school. He had his own chemistry set, gifted by his father, who thought he was encouraging a young scientist. But Graham wasn't doing science fair projects. He was experimenting on mice, cats, and eventually, people. At home, strange things began to happen. His stepmother grew ill with strange symptoms: vomiting, weakness, and confusion. Graham's sister got sick too. His father noticed a pattern: every weekend after sharing a drink with Graham, he'd become violently ill. The family doctor was baffled. No one thought to suspect the boy with the quiet smile and deep fascination with chemicals. But someone else began to notice: Graham's chemistry teacher. After several students in Graham's school became sick for no clear reason, the teacher found disturbing notes in his textbooks detailed recipes for poisons and experiments. Alarmed, he contacted the police. What they discovered shocked everyone. Hidden in Graham's belongings were vials of poison, including thallium and antimony, deadly substances that had no business in the hands of a teenager. When questioned, Graham showed no fear. In fact, he seemed proud. Calmly, he admitted to experimenting on animals and family members. He was only 14 years old. In 1962, Graham was arrested and sent to Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital. Doctors called him a danger to society. But even behind locked doors, he didn't stop. Rumors spread that he poisoned other inmates. He spent his time studying advanced chemistry, planning for the future. And eventually, that future arrived. In 1971, at just 23 years old, Graham Young was released, deemed no longer a threat. What the world didn't know was that Graham had never let go of his obsession. He didn't want a normal life. He wanted data. He wanted test subjects. He wanted to perfect his deadly knowledge. And this time, he had an entire workplace to experiment on. When Graham Young walked out of Broadmoor Hospital in 1971, he was no longer the curious boy with test tubes hidden under his bed. He was now a young man, calm, charming, and more dangerous than ever. The authorities believed he had changed. The psychiatrists believed he was ready to live among society again. But Graham had no intention of blending in. He had plans. And those plans needed people, and poison. Shortly after his release, Graham moved quietly into a new job. He became a storehouse assistant at John Hadland Laboratories in the quiet village of Bovingdon. It was a normal place, far from the chaos of his past. No one there knew about his history. No one suspected that a convicted poisoner was pushing the tea cart through their offices. It didn't take long for the sickness to begin. Only a few weeks after Graham joined, employees started reporting strange symptoms: nausea, numbness, exhaustion. Some fainted at work. Others developed bizarre neurological issues. Hair loss, stomach pain, muscle weakness. But no one thought it was foul play. People blamed the flu, stress, bad food. Meanwhile, Graham continued to serve tea and coffee during breaks. He knew which cup belonged to whom. He even noted their symptoms in a secret diary he kept hidden in his apartment. What looked like kindness, offering biscuits, serving drinks, was something far darker. These weren't acts of hospitality. They were tests. Each victim was part of an experiment. Graham was watching how thallium affected the human body in real time. He wrote notes like a scientist studying lab rats. Except these rats were his coworkers, his friends. And no one suspected a thing. The symptoms became more severe. Some victims collapsed. One lost the ability to walk. Another suffered chest pain so intense he begged doctors to end his suffering. Still, no cause could be found. Tests came back clean. No virus. No contamination. Nothing that explained the wave of mysterious illness that had swept through the lab. Then came the deaths. First, Bob Eggle, a kind-hearted technician, died after a sudden decline. Weeks later, Fred Biggs, a part-time worker, followed. Both men had shared drinks, shared laughter, and shared a quiet death sentence delivered by someone they trusted. Behind his blank expression, Graham was keeping score. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to understand the perfect balance of pain, dosage, and timing. This wasn't about hate. It wasn't about revenge. It was about control. The same boy who once tested poisons on his stepmother was now using his colleagues as human experiments. And all the while, he smiled, offered tea, and asked, "Are you feeling all right today?" By late 1971, the quiet halls of John Hadland Laboratories were no longer just a workplace they felt cursed. Dozens of employees had fallen ill. Some were hospitalized. 2 had died. And the medical community still had no answers. The staff were anxious, whispers turned into fear, and every stomachache felt like a warning. Then something strange happened during a company health meeting. The lab's doctor, Ian Anderson, stood in front of the employees and tried to calm everyone down. He reassured them, "This is not chemical poisoning. There is no danger in our working environment." But before he could even finish, someone stood up. It wasn't a manager. Not a scientist. Just a soft-spoken man in the back of the room, the warehouse assistant, Graham Young. Calmly, politely, Graham asked why thallium poisoning had been ruled out. He began to describe the exact symptoms of thallium exposure: hair loss, nerve damage, paralysis. Every word echoed like thunder in that quiet room. The symptoms he described matched the victims perfectly. It was too accurate. At first, the room fell silent. Then came suspicion. Who was this man? How did he know so much about rare poisons? What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that Graham wasn't just curious. He was an expert. In fact, he had studied thallium poisoning for years. And this wasn't the first time he had stood at the center of a silent storm. As whispers spread, some employees remembered past rumors, strange things Graham had said. His obsession with Hitler. His long speeches about famous murderers. His unnatural knowledge of toxic substances. And worst of all, his connection to the very people who had gotten sick. The company directors began to dig. What they found chilled them to the bone. Graham Young wasn't just a shy assistant. He was a convicted poisoner. A boy once locked away in a psychiatric hospital for poisoning his own family. A name that had once disappeared from the headlines was now very much alive, and working in their building. The police were called. Quietly, without alerting Graham, an investigation was launched. Officers began retracing the timeline. When had employees first fallen ill? When had Graham been hired? The answer was horrifying: the symptoms began almost immediately after his arrival. And as his position changed, so did the pattern. When Graham was promoted, new victims emerged. Then came the detail that sealed it. Tea time. Graham had been delivering drinks to the very people who fell ill. Each cup was labeled with a name. He had opportunity, access, and knowledge. But what truly confirmed it was his diary. Police found pages filled with notes, precise doses, victim reactions, timelines, and personal thoughts. He had recorded everything like a scientist recording the results of an experiment. Only this experiment was on human lives. At last, the truth was clear. This wasn't illness. It wasn't a curse. It was calculated poisoning, cold, quiet, and deliberate. And the man behind it had never stopped smiling. To understand how a young man could walk into a laboratory and quietly poison his co-workers with surgical precision, we have to go back to where Graham Young's darkness first took root. He was born in 1947, in North London. From the outside, his childhood didn't seem especially different. But inside the walls of his home, things weren't right. His mother died when he was just a baby. His father remarried, and Graham was sent to live with relatives for a while. He was later reunited with his family, but he was never the same. Even as a child, Graham stood out not because he was loud, but because he was quiet. Too quiet. He didn't laugh much. Didn't play with other kids. Instead, he spent hours reading books on forensics, Nazi ideology, and most disturbingly, poisons. While other teenagers were discovering music and romance, Graham was idolizing Adolf Hitler and infamous killers. He proudly wore Nazi symbols and spoke about mass murder with a strange, clinical fascination. Some classmates called him the Little Doctor. Others simply avoided him. At the age of 13, Graham began studying toxicology not from school, but from medical journals he found himself. He collected chemicals, kept secret notebooks, and began testing his knowledge, not in theory, but in practice. That same year, his stepmother fell seriously ill. She suffered from repeated vomiting, stomach pain, and rapid aging. Doctors couldn't figure it out. His sister also got sick, then his father always after sharing drinks or meals with Graham. The signs were there, but no one dared believe a boy could be capable of such harm. But Graham wasn't experimenting randomly. He was calculating. He wanted to see the effects. He wanted to perfect the art. To him, these weren't family members. They were subjects. Eventually, it was a school chemistry teacher who connected the dots. When students and even teachers began to fall ill without explanation, the teacher investigated and found vials of poison hidden in Graham's school bag. Alongside them, chilling handwritten notes listing symptoms, doses, and chemical breakdowns. Graham was arrested in 1962, at just 14 years old. During questioning, he showed no remorse. In fact, he was proud. He explained how he obtained the chemicals, how he tricked teachers into thinking he needed poisons for school projects. His voice was calm. His eyes cold. His fascination had no trace of guilt. He was sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, where he spent nearly a decade. Doctors called him a danger to society. But even behind bars, Graham found ways to experiment. Inmates and staff fell ill mysteriously. Accidents happened. And yet, nothing could ever be proven. Then, in 1971, the unthinkable happened. Graham was released. He was declared rehabilitated. A young man given a second chance. A clean slate. A fresh start. But Graham didn't want redemption. He wanted to continue what he'd started. And this time, he would be smarter, colder, and deadlier. When police entered Graham Young's small apartment, they weren't expecting much. Maybe a few bottles of chemicals, a strange book or two. But what they found instead was far more chilling than any stash of poison. It was a diary. Plain on the outside. Ordinary. But inside, it was a blueprint for horror. Graham had recorded everything: doses, symptoms, reactions. Pages and pages of handwritten notes, each one cold, clinical, and terrifying. Each entry was not a confession. It was a report. As if he was writing a medical study, not describing the suffering of human beings. He used initials to mark his victims: F for Fred Biggs, D for David Tilson, and so on. He tracked how many milligrams of thallium he used. He noted their reactions: vomiting, confusion, paralysis. And then, he analyzed how they died. Of Bob Eggle, one of his earliest victims, Graham wrote with strange detachment. Still alive after 10 days. Dose should have been lethal. Very disappointing. Of Fred Biggs, whose nervous system had collapsed before death, he wrote. Fred is almost gone. Blind, paralyzed. Death will be a release. It wasn't just what he wrote, it was how he wrote it. No emotion. No regret. Just data. Observation. As if the people around him were not friends or colleagues, but lab rats in a twisted experiment. One entry read: Diana looked at me angrily today. So I made her go home. We'll see how she feels tomorrow. In another, he wrote about a delivery driver. A shame, he was a kind man. But once I start, I must continue. I've already decided. To Graham, suffering wasn't the side effect, it was the point. He wanted to watch the process, to understand how long a body could endure, to find the line between pain and death. And he wanted control. Control over time, over pain, over people. He detailed how he poisoned their tea, how he identified each mug by name, how he planned who would suffer next. He even wrote about his satisfaction, how watching his victims slowly crumble gave him a sense of power. And this wasn't a secret life hidden in the shadows. Graham did it all while shaking hands, pouring coffee, and asking, "How are you feeling today?" The diary was the smoking gun. A window into a disturbed mind that didn't just kill, it calculated. For the police, this wasn't just evidence, it was motive, method, and confession all in one. And for the world, it was the terrifying realization that evil can come in the form of a quiet young man with a teacup and a smile. On June 19, 1972, the Royal Courts of Justice in London became the stage for one of the most unsettling trials in British history. The press called it the trial of the Teacup Killer. But Graham Young didn't like that name. To him, it was far too small for what he had done. In his mind, he wasn't just a man who poisoned drinks. He was a scientist, a visionary, a master of death. He stood in court, just 24 years old, wearing a suit and the same calm expression he'd worn while mixing poisons in the lab. But this time, the world was watching. The charges were heavy. 2 counts of murder. 2 counts of attempted murder. 4 counts of causing grievous bodily harm through poisoning. As the prosecution laid out the case, the courtroom listened in stunned silence. The diary entries were read aloud, pages filled with emotionless records of death. The symptoms, the doses, the nicknames he gave to each subject. It was clinical, cold, and undeniable. Doctors testified that thallium, the poison Graham used, was found in the remains of Fred Biggs and Bob Eggle. In Biggs' bones and organs, the levels were so high it shocked the forensic pathologists. It was clear, he had been slowly, methodically poisoned over weeks. And then came the journal. In Graham's own words, he described each man's decline. It wasn't a confession, it was documentation. Like a twisted science project. But what chilled everyone most wasn't the evidence. It was Graham himself. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He didn't even look nervous. In fact, during cross-examination, he smiled. He corrected the prosecution on chemical details. He debated medical theories. He treated the trial not as judgment but as recognition. Even his own defense team was shaken. One psychologist who evaluated Graham described him as a man without empathy, without remorse, and without doubt. It took the jury just 38 minutes to reach a verdict. Graham Young was found guilty on all charges. The judge, visibly disturbed, sentenced him to life imprisonment, stating, "You are so dangerous, so clever, and so calculating that I believe you must never be released again." But the damage had already been done. The public was outraged not just at Graham, but at the system. How could a known poisoner, once committed for trying to kill his own family, be released without proper supervision? How could no one be warned? Parliament demanded answers. The Home Secretary had to publicly apologize. The Mental Health Act was reviewed. Rules around releasing psychiatric patients were rewritten. Even laws around the sale and storage of toxic substances were changed, all because of one man, one smile, and a cup of tea. In the end, Graham got exactly what he wanted, not just control over life and death, but a place in history. Life behind bars didn't stop Graham Young from being Graham Young. Locked away in Parkhurst Prison, a high-security facility, Graham was no longer surrounded by teacups or lab coats. But that didn't mean he faded into the background. If anything, his presence only grew more unsettling. Fellow inmates were warned to stay away. Guards kept a cautious eye. But Graham always composed, always calculated, quickly adapted. He requested books on advanced toxicology, took notes, and continued to sharpen the very skill set that had put him there. To him, prison wasn't punishment. It was a laboratory without chemicals. And in that dark corner of the prison system, something even more disturbing happened. He made friends. Among them was Ian Brady, the infamous Moors murderer, a serial killer obsessed with power and control. The two bonded over philosophy, violence, and chillingly Hitler. Brady later described Graham as completely without human feeling, a cold machine who admired pain and precision. Graham, in turn, seemed to enjoy this reputation. He hated being called the Teacup Poisoner, thought it was too small, too quaint. He preferred something grander, more mythic. The world's greatest poisoner. That was how he wanted to be remembered. Even in confinement, the system didn't quite know what to do with him. Some psychiatrists continued to believe he was misunderstood. Others warned, "This man is incurable. His charm is dangerous. His mind is a weapon." In the years that followed, journalists tried to interview him. Graham would occasionally agree, only to speak cryptically, coldly. When asked if he regretted anything, he famously answered, "Regret implies you didn't enjoy it." In 1990, just a month before his 43rd birthday, Graham Young was found dead in his prison cell. The official cause, heart attack. But to this day, many suspect otherwise. Graham had no known heart issues. Some believe he took his own life. Others think it was karma. Some even whisper ironically that he was poisoned. His ashes were scattered at sea. No funeral. No monument. But his legacy lived on. The British legal system was forever changed by his crimes. Psychiatric release procedures were rewritten. Poison control laws were strengthened. And mental health evaluations became far stricter, especially for violent offenders. Yet Graham's story didn't vanish into history books. He became the subject of documentaries, books, even a feature film. In a disturbingly twisted way, he got what he wanted: immortality. Perhaps the most unsettling part of his legacy came in 2005, when a 17-year-old Japanese girl, inspired by Graham's story, poisoned her own mother using thallium, just as he did. She even documented it in a diary, mimicking her idol's cold, scientific tone. Graham Young may have died in a prison cell. But the shadow he cast didn't end there. When we look back at the life of Graham Young, we don't just see a killer. We see a paradox. Here was a man with the mind of a scientist, the curiosity of a scholar, and the ambition of a mastermind. But instead of using those gifts to heal or create, he chose to destroy slowly, methodically, and without remorse. Was he a genius? Undoubtedly. Was he a monster? Without question. But the most unsettling truth may be that he was both. Graham didn't kill for revenge. He didn't kill in a rage. He wasn't driven by impulse or chaos. He killed because he wanted to know. Because he was obsessed with how the human body failed. Because he viewed pain as data. He treated people the way a chemist treats chemicals. Mix observe. Note the result. In his diary, he didn't express hate or guilt. He expressed satisfaction, pride in the accuracy of his predictions. Joy in seeing how a perfectly measured dose could paralyze, blind, or silence someone forever. And yet, the world enabled him. He was released from a psychiatric hospital at age 23, despite a history of poisoning his own family. He was given a job with no background check. He was allowed to move freely, all while carrying the knowledge and the desire to kill again. His story forced a nation to confront its failures. Small Blue Diamond, a legal system too trusting. Small Blue Diamond, a mental health system too lenient. Small Blue Diamond, a society that underestimated the quiet ones. Graham Young didn't just leave behind victims, he left behind a warning. That intellect without empathy is dangerous. That charm without conscience is lethal. And that sometimes, the deadliest weapon, is curiosity without a soul. Today, his name still haunts crime textbooks, forensic lectures, and psychological case studies. The boy who wanted to become the world's greatest poisoner, succeeded in becoming a cautionary tale. A tale that reminds us, evil doesn't always come with a knife or a gun. Sometimes, it comes in a teacup, served with a smile, and the question, "Would you like some sugar with that?"